I was at a meeting last night with somebody from the Big Society Network who said he had a very good example of how the Big Society would work in practice, and it came from a school somewhere in East Anglia, I think, and he said they decided they'd sack all the cleaners and do the cleaning work voluntarily among the parents. And so I had to ask myself and them, what happened to the cleaners? What will happen to their jobs? What will happen to their lives? There are a lot of really difficult questions here, which I will go into in more detail in a bit. Only half the population knows that the Big Society exists, has ever heard of the phrase. But when you get in amongst the policymakers and the government officials and the think tanks and the local councils and charities and businesses, it's a huge preoccupation, as Mark has suggested. It's on everybody's lips, and it's the subject of a massive rebranding exercise. So everybody's busy rebranding what they were doing as X and the Big Society and Y and the Big Society. But this publication is actually about the Big Society. The phrase may sound like apple pie and motherhood, but it's actually a major program for structural reform. It's the social policy that makes the economic policy of the spending review politically possible. The government couldn't possibly have taken its axe to the public sector with such composed ruthlessness without a story to tell about how the gaps would be filled by a retreating state. And the Big Society is that story. And at one level, it's utterly beguiling. It promotes ideas that many of us, not least the New Economics Foundation, have been promoting for ages. So more power to citizens, decentralized government, free up civil society from the rule-bound orthodoxies of the welfare state, let charities do more of what they do well, make better use of everyday human resources. Yes, please, we want all of these things. But the real meaning of the Big Society can only really be understood against the backdrop of the cuts. Cuts of more than 80 billion, a 27% drop in local council budgets, 18 billion off the welfare bill, the bonfire of the quangos, and much, much more. And together, when you put the spending cuts and the Big Society together, they signal the end of the post-war settlement. And that means the end of the era when a democratically elected government raised taxes to provide a secure framework of publicly owned and controlled goods and services so that everybody, regardless of background and circumstance, could have access to essential services and could be protected from risks that they couldn't themselves control or cope with. So that was the post-war settlement in a nutshell. And this program of structural reform called the Big Society involves a massive shift of responsibility from the state to individuals and families and so-called communities, whatever they may be, and from public services to self-help, mutual aid, charities, philanthropy, local enterprise, and big business. And it's backed up, for all the sort of vagueness about, oh, we must just let it happen, by a very concerted program of structural reforms within government. One of the top priorities of that is to help build a big society. There's a lot of, focused government intervention, big intervention by government, if you like, to make the Big Society work, including the Big Society Bank, 5,000 community organisers, the National Citizens Service, the Big Society Network, 4 Vanguard communities, and on and on. So there's a lot of determination there to make it happen. And Steve Hilton, who's David Cameron's Director of Strategy, says the aim, and I quote, is nothing less than to wean this country off its apparently unbreakable dependency upon the state, centralism, welfare, and rule from Whitehall. These are the corrosive habits of half a century. So that's what it's about. And there certainly is a strong case for reforming the welfare state. It's always depended on unlimited economic growth to provide more and better services. Now that growth is uncertain, quite apart from the deficit problem, not just because of the nature of the financial crisis, but also because it is because of climate change and the fact that it may be inconsistent with the need to meet carbon reduction targets, but that's another story. In addition, of course, the public sector is stuck in a bit of a rut. There are too many rules and targets. They do have ways of delivering services that make people feel powerless to help themselves. They do have very little success in preventing needs arising in the first place, and none at all in stemming the upward spiraling of costs. So it is time for change, but is the big society the solution? And this leads to some big questions. First of all, is the big society big enough for all of us? Well, we don't all have the same capacity to participate in citizen action. It depends on what we know, where we live, on our education, on how we feel about ourselves, on our experience, on how close we are to people and places where things get done. And with this great shift of activity from public sector to private and voluntary sectors, a lot depends on how these new organizations behave and who they include. They all have boundaries which are determined variously by kinship and law and status and geography and ethnicity and so on. And these boundaries include some people and exclude others. But some are much bigger and stronger and more assertive. And there's nothing so far in the plans for the big society to make sure that the larger and more powerful organizations don't monopolize the action or flourish at the expense of others. And then there's the question of time. The big society and the cuts are all about replacing paid with unpaid labor. And that means that people have to find spare time. And some people have more spare time than others. And if you're a low-paid worker with lots of family responsibilities, how on earth will you have time to participate in the big society, let alone to benefit from it? So capacity and access and time are all unequally distributed. And not surprisingly, the NCVO tells us that people who volunteer and take part in local action are typically white, older, and middle class. And this shift from the state to civil society will intensify this pattern. Those who can will, those who can't won't, and those who don't take part won't be empowered and won't reap any of the benefits. And meanwhile, the poorest neighborhoods, by all accounts, which rely most heavily on public services and on public employment, will suffer most from the impact of the cuts. There are 500,000 jobs to go in the public sector and something like 1.6 million at the latest estimate to go across the board. And women, who make up 2/3 of public sector employees, will take the hardest hit. And unemployment will pile up problems as people lose homes, pensions, rights, and prospects for improving their lives, not just earned income. And people without jobs will face tighter and more punitive benefit rules, drastically pared down public services. There'll be more polarization both within and between neighborhoods as the poorest are put to flight in search of affordable accommodation. And these are the conditions in which the big society is supposed to take root and flourish. And all those small charities and community groups that are supposed to be the life and soul of the big society are already painfully squeezed as council grants and contracts are being scaled back. And now they're expected to step in and vastly increase their activities to help rising numbers of poor, jobless, insecure, and unsupported individuals and families. The spending review set aside 470 million over 4 years to help build the big society, and that includes a £100 million pound fund to help local organisations to make the transition, and all that is a drop in the ocean compared to the scale of the cuts overall. And in any case, if voluntary groups and charities have all these new responsibilities thrust on them, what will it do to them? The government's got plans to help them, and this involves, in Cabinet Office parlance, searching online for toolkits and resources, following signposts to infrastructure services, I'm quoting here, accessing skills from pro bono volunteers, applying for bursaries, and on top of this, they're encouraged to merge with one another, to grow bigger, and to become more entrepreneurial. Well, I think we all know that people usually volunteer to participate in local activities when they find them optional, small scale, convivial, and life-enhancing. And all this sounds a bit different from that. Conditional, formalized, complicated, and hard graft. And so will the drive towards growth and commodification threaten the very things we cherish most about civil society, its diversity, its spontaneity, its openness, and its free spirit? Now, when it comes to the private sector, the government wants to develop more value-driven organisations with alternative forms of ownership, so co-ops, mutuals, social enterprises. That's all great, but it will take time for them to get up and running and to develop the skills and the capacity they'll need to take over all these functions. Meanwhile, who's out there limbering up? But the big corporates. They've already got the experience in bidding for contracts and delivering on a large scale. And don't let's forget Sir Philip Green's advice to government to save money through more centralised, large-scale purchasing. Paul Pindar, who's Chief Executive of Capita, leading contractor for outsourced government business, has put it on record that he is, and I quote, eagerly anticipating the forthcoming age of austerity. And he expects a greater degree of activity over the next 5 years than over the last 5 years. Now, shareholders of his organisation and others, of course, have very different interests and priorities from those of service users, especially those who are the most disadvantaged. We've already seen how the big corporate brands can strip out the individuality from our high streets and give us what Neff calls clone towns. So the question now is whether the likes of Capita and United Health and Serco and Pricewaterhouse and KPMG, Deloitte's and probably Tesco and Asda as well, will do the same for the welfare state. And if so, what happens to those little platoons that are supposed to be the life force of the big society? And who's going to be accountable for what? There'll be plenty of opportunities for things to go horribly awry with potentially disastrous consequences. It is hard to imagine how an indeterminate number of infinitely varied organisations can be knitted together into an accountability framework. But without some clear lines of accountability, only those who can shout loudest or can whip up the most colourful outrage in the media will have their voices heard. And this brings us back to the question of the programme of structural change. The plan for a big society enables and justifies the plan for a much smaller state. Now, none of us wants a big, overbearing state that makes us feel small and powerless and remote. But we do want, I think, a democratic state that is strong enough and strategic enough to make sure that resources are fairly distributed, that human rights are protected, that essential services are delivered, and that the poor and the powerless will be protected against the rich and the strong. There's a section at the end of our report which sets out our ideas for making the best of the big society, because we remain, in spite of this critique, passionately committed to the best ideals that lie behind the whole plan. We suggest, for starters, that it needs clear goals that are about ends and not means. I mean, what's the point of devolving power, shifting responsibility to civil service? Why are we doing this? And we suggest that it should be about, the goal should be social justice and well-being for all. And that means including measures to make sure everyone can participate and benefit. We suggest a shorter working week to help distribute paid and unpaid time more evenly across the population. We've done some more work on that at NEF. And clear lines of accountability. And finally, there's no point transferring services to charities and businesses if they simply replicate the least admirable features of the public sector, where providers do things to passive and disempowered and supposedly grateful service users. And that's why one of our big ideas is to make co-production the standard way of getting things done. And this is where professionals and the people they're supposed to be helping, along with their family members and neighbours, whatever is appropriate, form together in equal and reciprocal partnerships so that they decide what needs to be done, they work out how to do it, and then they deliver together what is needed. And it absolutely changes the whole idea about what services are. We think that this approach can be genuinely empowering, that it really does tap into valuable human resources. It helps to build and strengthen social networks. It helps to prevent needs arising. And if we put the principles of co-production at the heart of the big society to define and shape how things get done across all sectors, we would get better outcomes and we would get real efficiencies. But you have to invest in developing co-production. It takes time, it takes resources, and the same go for measures to ensure equal opportunity, to ensure accountability, and all the other things we need to do in order to make the big society work. But it's hard to see how any of this can happen with the scale and speed of deficit reduction that we seem to be facing now. So to put all this in a nutshell, the big society story makes the public spending cuts possible, but the cuts make the best ideals of the big society impossible to realize. Thank you.
So thank you very much for coming. It's great to see so many people here, especially people who I don't normally see at policy seminars. I should just begin with a bit of a disclaimer. I am a Tory, but and I was introduced as being from my business, and I am from my business, but none of this is on behalf of my business. I don't want anybody there to kind of get their knickers in a twist. But I have been involved in the development of the big society idea for some time. And I first met Steve Hilton, who you referred to, David Cameron's chief strategist, about 3 years ago now. And I was not involved in politics then, and I was totally entranced by the vision of what he was setting out. I felt it was so fresh and new and exciting. So I came not as a kind of lifelong Tory activist or die-hard for this, but I've become that, and I am really convinced about it. So I hope I can put some of that across to you and answer some of Anna's reasonable but I think mistaken concerns about it. Whilst I was working for the Conservatives, I helped develop a paper called The Strong Society, which predated the recession, predated the cuts, predated us even thinking about that. And I then went on to be a bit involved in that, and I went to work at Demos and carried on with some of this work. And I'm involved with the Big Society Network and the government's advisory panel on it. So, get all that out of the way. I think the first thing to say is how it's quite easy for us to forget how incredibly exciting it is to have a prime minister, the most important person in politics, saying that they regard charity, social enterprise, civil society as their biggest passion, their number one interest. I mean, that is actually very unusual. We've become a bit used to it because Cameron had a very long run-in from when he got chosen as Tory leader to when he got chosen as everybody else's leader. And so he talked about it in that time. I think we kind of got used to it, but if you go back to, not that far back, but, 2004 or 3 or something like that, for politicians to stand up and say, I'm really, really passionate about civil society and that's my main thing, would be very unusual. So I think it's good for us to remind ourselves about the radicalism of what he's proposing. And I think Mark's introduction sets out very neatly that this is really bold, and it is not... when I was working for Cameron, I was very puzzled most of the time because people were always saying, he doesn't stand for anything, tell me what he believes in, all this kind of thing. I felt like he stood for a lot. I think he hasn't always been excellent at explaining it, and perhaps you see that bit in the way that we've tried to explain the big society since then. But the nub of what he's trying to do is to become... I actually wrote this in a speech for him once, which he wisely didn't give. But the nub of what he's trying to become is the weakest prime minister in history. That is his aim, I think. He wants to give away power, and he wants to say to public services and all of us really, that actually as ministers your role is not to sweat away endlessly trying to find the right idea. It isn't that you go and even see something on the ground and think, oh, what a brilliant scheme, we must replicate that everywhere. The aim for ministers is to say, look, I don't know anything at all about what it's like to be homeless. I do not know about that because I haven't been homeless. I've never slept rough, so I basically can't make policy on it. But what I can do is put my time, my effort, my grey hairs, my late nights and red boxes into trying to work out what sort of structure might help people who do know about that to get what needs to be done. And that's quite a sort of pithy little encapsulation, I hope, but behind it, that's a very big change in the way we think about government. I should caveat probably what I'm going to say by pointing out that I'm kind of an advocate of the big society as it stands in its purest theory, and I'm very aware that when you do it on the ground, a whole load of people will misunderstand it, a whole load of people will do something different and claim it's the big society. So there's going to be a lot of bad mistakes, there's going to be a lot of rubbish in it, but I kind of try to give them the benefit of the doubt, because I think that happens when you're trying to do something very big. So I'm just going to run through quickly what it is not first, and then I think what I think it is, and then talk about some of the gaps that Anna touched on, and some of the influences that she thinks it draws from, and I'll stop as quickly as I can. So what it is not, I think it's certainly not about starting your own school. It's not about volunteering. It's not about cuts. I mean, volunteering and starting your own school are part of it, but that is not what it is. It is not that we roll back the state and we hope naively that altruism swings in and fills the gap. You know, that is not likely to happen, at least not in a kind of immediate time frame of 10, single-digit years, rather than maybe tens of years. So if you think that it's all about, we're going to cut your hospital and we're all going to be our own nurses, it's just, that is not the case, and don't let people pretend to you that that is what it's about. Although volunteering does have a place in it, it's not the whole story. And as I say, it's not about cuts, because it was something that I think, although we hadn't named it as the big society in Tory circles, it was something that actually we've been thinking about and talking about in depth all the way through 2005, 6, 7, before Lehman Brothers was on the news. It's also not about government. I was quite struck, both in the report and what Anna said, about the extent to which she talked about public services, public sector workers, public services. It's not about cuts, it's not about public services, it's not about government, it's about culture, it's about the society we live in, and whether we live in the kind of country we want to live in, and how easy it is for you to play a part in changing the kind of country that you live in. And so I think it's more comparable, say, to the fight over 30, 50, 100 years against racism in society, in which government has played a role and funded things and done stuff and passed laws. It wasn't passive, it did do things, but government has not stamped out racism. We have all done that collectively, and there's still more work to do. And I think big society is a bit the same. It's a cultural change, which I would fully anticipate, if it was successful, would take 30, 40 years. But I think that's okay, because I anticipate living for 30, 40 years. So I want to live in that society. So a bit about what it is. The pithiest way I can explain it probably is in 3 chunks. So it's absolutely true that there is a bit which is about people who are already very involved in this kind of stuff, people who are hardcore volunteers of the type that NCVO and Anna outlined, people who run charities and work in the social sector and that kind of thing. It is about listening to them and making their life more easy, and that involves things to do with social finance and lots of quite technical stuff. So in that sense, it's a bit like the Office of the Third Sector, but kind of turned up a notch. But that's only one bit of it. At the other end of the spectrum, second chunk, is kind of the opposite. It's about people who are not really that involved in this stuff at all. And some people think this matters a lot, and some people think it doesn't matter at all. So when I go for a walk and I see somebody walking the other way with their dog, I say, good afternoon. Or I hope I do. Actually, often I don't. I just pretend they're not even there, and I kind of blank them out. And, because I'm sort of English and worried that it's rude to say good morning to them. And I think that stuff is very important. I think it matters that when you go on a bus and somebody in the back of the bus is playing music on their mobile phone, I find that really irritating. I feel like I should say something, but I don't, and so a little bit of me dies. But I think it's also sad that they come from a subculture where they have a different cultural rule to my middle-class values, and they don't feel offended by it. These kind of issues, I think, are very important. And what can government do about that? Not that much, actually. There's a few policies, like National Citizen Service and things. But most of it is about talking about it. And I think what Cameron is trying to do there is to shift this from being an issue that is part of the politics pages of the newspaper to being in the sort of the style section or the Sunday Times magazine or something. He wants to shift it from being a purely political issue to talk about this to be something that we all talk about in the pub. And I think he's doing that quite well. And then the crucial bit, the bit that's in the middle, is about public services and how you can make public services support this. So there's a kind of supply side bit, which is freeing up public services so that they are open and willing and allow you to take action. And then there's a very important demand side bit about people wanting to take action and getting involved. So in that, I would say the Big Society Network is as interested in Bethnal Green Football Club as it is in Help the Aged. It's about stuff which is small and informal and you and your mates as much as it is about a big charity which will now do a public service thing. I will close shortly. Just to touch on some of the problems that Anna picked up on. There's a problem, you're quite right, about can everybody get involved in this? I would say that it's not a zero-sum game. So if Mark decides that he wants to go and volunteer in a homeless shelter near him, I don't think that makes a society worse. I think it makes it better. So I don't mind if some middle-class, probably people, are getting super involved in this and others are maybe not. I don't think that's a problem. I also think my experience is, and I spent some time living on an estate in Birmingham, that the people who were in deep poverty there were very socially active, actually. So I think it's not always true just to say this is kind of middle-class, working-class problem. There are some gaps. I think that one of the things we really need to do is to make it easier to get involved if you just want to do it for 10 seconds. In Lewisham, they have an app that you can download onto your smartphone in which you can photograph some graffiti and upload it to the council and say, there's some graffiti here, could you come and fix it? Or I've got a suggestion, just send it in. You can do that on your walk to the tube. That's very easy to do. Finally, just to close on influence and what has influenced the ideas, Anna points to a couple of thinkers like Ruskin and so on, and I think people like Burke did influence this to an extent, but it's actually very influenced by a number of modern intellectual trends, which the RSA has really brought to the fore, amongst others. The influence of the internet and what is now possible to do to coordinate and organise without somebody telling you what to do or a bright person in Whitehall doing it. I think there's learnings from neuroscience and behavioural economics which have really influenced it. And fundamentally, I think it's about a change in our whole society, which is away from a 20th century factory model of efficiency to a 21st century model of what I would call human efficiency, which is not focusing so much on the kind of Philip Green style savings of printing double-sided in government offices and things like that, but is focused on tackling people's real problems and hence getting real value from them. So I look forward to hundreds of questions.
The last time I was in this room was 12 years ago, and I was getting married. And I can tell you I was a lot more nervous then than I am now. Big society. I think there's a lot of cynicism about this idea. I'll come back to that later. I'm not one of those cynics. I may work for The Guardian, but I'm not a cynic about big society. For me, the question is not whether it's a good idea, but whether it can work and how can we make it work. I have to say I'm struck about how quickly this phrase has gained acceptance and traction. And I'd say that actually the media lags behind, certainly the voluntary sector and public services in this respect. I think journalists may not understand it very well. And I think the point that Jonty made about it being very much misunderstood within the kind of Whitehall village lobby world is a good one. I think the voluntary sector certainly does. And in an odd kind of way, I think big society has kind of rebooted the idea of voluntarism. It's given it fresh impetus to basically something that the voluntary sector has been doing for years. So I think it was caricatured in the election campaign and seen as a cynical marketing wheeze, but I think it seems to me that it's fairly embedded in policy discourse these days. And incidentally, I fully expect Labour, their Unite sponsorship notwithstanding, to come up with their own version and iteration of big society. I just want to pay a quick tribute to Anna's report. I only read the introduction this morning, and I think 4 points that jumped out to me. One, the point about access, who gets left out, very important. Interdependency of government and big society, again, crucial. The impacts on charities, I'll come to that. And the emphasis on co-production. Now, I'm not a great policy thinker, unlike Anna, so these are some journalists' observations of how I think big society is panning out. Firstly, I'll talk about leadership, and I think there are some potential problems in terms of leadership for big society. We know David Cameron is a big fan. We heard his speech at Tory Party conference, where he spoke a lot about big society. I'm not sure that there is a consensus within the Conservative Party in support of big society, let alone a coalition. I was struck when I met a member of the 1922 Backbench Committee a few months ago about how deeply contemptuous he was of big society and charities. And indeed, a charity director said to me the other day, what struck me is just how so many Conservative MPs don't see charities as a partner, which I thought was extraordinary. I think that's partly because I think they think the voluntary sector is full of people like me who are left-wing and read The Guardian. And I think there's a deep suspicion of the non-cuddly campaigning bits of the voluntary sector. It's a kind of hospice is good, child poverty campaigning groups bad ideal of the voluntary sector. So that's one problem. The second one is culture and ideology, which Jonty referred to. I've noticed there's a real fundamentalist streak in some iterations of big society, and sometimes this verges on the mystic. Here's the Lord Way, who's the big society guru, a former McKinsey consultant, who said in a speech about big society, there will always be a part of big society which will remain mysterious and yet also enticing, like life itself. As one social entrepreneur tweeted the very next day, isn't this not the big society, but the big spliff society? Lord Way, and I don't want you to think I'm having a Lord Way, but he articulates this strand of thinking very well. He's obsessed with the supposedly toxic presence of the state and all these terrible contracts and grants with which it corrupts charities. And it forces these community groups into relationships of abject dependency on the great state. And I think the problem with that kind of purity, ideological purity, is that I think it finds it very difficult. I think he finds it very difficult to conceive of a partnership between the state and civil society. And I worry about that anti-collaborative streak within big society. I think that one of the problems with this purist ideology is that it taps into something I see a lot in, I've seen a lot in the voluntary sector recently, which is what I call the romantic ideal of voluntarism, which is actually quite deep in the charity psyche. And this somehow, in the way that charities often, I think, always look on the bright side of life, and however hard and onerous the economy, their little economy might be, they are always looking for ways, quite rightly, to respond to this. And that somehow, having no grants or money or infrastructural support will somehow actually liberate us. And that if the state recedes, then these activists will find themselves in this kind of prelapsarian self-help nirvana. I think the gap in provision caused by the withdrawal of some of the services, as Anna said, and these are services that a lot of us will take for granted, cannot be bridged merely by enthusiasm and an iPhone. Yes, we can look after our park. I can see how we can do that. Yes, we can cut the verges of the roads going through the village. I can see that. I don't quite see how big society is going to do the work of, say, Fairbridge, which is a charity which deals with some of the most damaged and difficult teenagers. I think the state can't do without civil society if it's going to improve and become more efficient. The vice versa is also true. Civil society can't do without the state. I see a lot of big society idealism around. I'd like to see a lot more big society realism. Third point, money, timing, support, implementation. I observe that the coalition wants to have it both ways, many times over, and there are real contradictions here. It seems to me it wants to drastically cut the deficit, and it has imposed quite onerous demands on councils to help it do that, but it doesn't want councils to cut charity funding. It wants councils to pursue a localist agenda, but it also wants to tell them what they should spend their money on and how. It wants to cut the deficit quickly, which will force many councils into massive, unplanned, short-term, early cuts. But it also wants councils to think strategically about how to involve charities and community groups into what it calls the local public services supply chain. Well, think about it. Charities will not know how much money they are going to receive next year in terms of grants until councils have worked out how much money they have after the local government finance settlement. That comes in December. Charities may not hear about whether their grant is going to be maintained till February. I think at best they're going to have 3 months. That's a very narrow window. And I know that many charities out there just do not know whether they will be in existence by next April. I think there's a sense in which I feel that the logic of the cuts is speeding away uncontrollably, and the government and big society is kind of left lagging, scrabbling away in its wake. And there was one manifestation of this, again, Lord Way, sorry, Nat Way, but it was you. He went to a community, a project in Ealing in West London. I think it was back in May. And this Ealing CVS had this brilliant volunteering scheme. where they got tens of thousands of volunteers. And NatWay came out of this and said, it's fantastic. This is the cutting edge of a lot of what community organising is looking to be about. Ministerial seal of approval. Within a month, the funding for that had been cut by central government. That volunteering scheme does no longer exist. I think there's going to be an awful lot more examples of that. So I think the problem for the government and big society is the government knows it must intervene to help big society, but it doesn't believe in intervention fundamentally. And even if it did, it actually has very few levers to pull. It can implore councils all it likes not to cut charity funding, but it can't force them to. So the timing is all wrong. And my big worry is by the time the commissioning white paper comes out around Christmas, which will advise councils on how they should deal with the voluntary sector, and even assuming that white paper would have any effect, many of the charities the government will rely upon for big society will be dead, dying, or missing in action. I'll stop there. Thanks.